And I just heard actually just today, a patient of mine said she's going away to Morocco or somewhere, and it's been more than 10 years since she's got her measles shot, and they told her that she needs to get another one because she's no longer immune for measles. What that's telling us is that they're not the same immunity, the natural immunity and the vaccine-induced immunity, because there is no involvement of the cell-mediated immune system with, generally speaking, with some there's a little bit, but with vaccines. And so therefore you will never get lifelong immunity. Therefore, and this is crucial, you will never get herd immunity through vaccinations.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 149, and my guest is Dr. Tom Cowan. Dr. Cowan is a long-time holistic physician living and practicing in San Francisco. He specializes in helping people heal through diet and natural medicines. Tom is a respected speaker and author, and today we talk to him about his latest book, Vaccines, Autoimmunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Illness. Listen, we know it's a controversial topic, and we've hit on it before. But Tom talks about it in a fresh way, super sensibly and with solid science. Basically, Tom postulates that vaccines do indeed reduce the likelihood of our contracting various illnesses, like whooping cough or the measles. However, this short-term help has long-term consequences for our health. Listen carefully as Tom touches on the science behind vaccinations, what is most likely to boost our natural immunity against sickness, and what leading scientists have to say about vaccines' efficacy for long-term positive health outcomes. Before we get into the conversation, we want to give a quick thanks to our sponsors, Vintage Tradition Tallow Balm, the original whole food of skincare. Check out their new products, including a paperboard tube for lips and on the go, at vintagetradition.com. And Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced liver, organ meats, and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show again.
Well, you have valuable information to bring to our listeners, and I want to kick things off with the story of your grandsons at the lake. Tell us why you included that story in your latest book and what it has to do with immunity and healing.
So the story was basically an attempt to demonstrate one of the things I've said a few times before and included in the book, which that children learn best when not taught. And even though that may seem like a strange thing to say, basically children, and I would actually say most people, they like to have their own initiative, and the best way to teach is only to respond to direct questions. So the example I gave was we had scheduled a week vacation in a sort of a lakeside house in New Hampshire with my two grandsons, who were 3 and 5 about at the time. And it was by a lake, and it had a very shallow part. And they were both, when we got there, non-swimmers. And I thought, well, this would be much better if I taught them to swim, because then they could swim and have fun, and we could sit on the beach and just watch. So first day I got in the lake and tried to teach them to swim and said, do this and that. And they just weren't interested and just sort of didn't pay attention. And the whole thing just didn't go very well. And luckily then I had the sense to say to myself, I'm not going to try to teach them. So I didn't. I just backed off. And then they basically within a day or so figured it out. And they would occasionally ask me something, but by the end of the week, they were both dog paddling very well around the shallow part of the lake. So it was just a demonstration of not teaching somebody is often the best way to help them learn.
And so it's also a parallel for how our bodies work well if we just back off a little bit, right?
Yep, you could say that. I mean, the job of a doctor should be to squire their patients to achieve better health, not to do it for them. There are, of course, times when you have to do something like surgery or give some medicine to intervene. But in the usual situation, that should not be the case. That should be a last resort rather than the way it is now, which is more of a first resort.
Right, because you say that the body is a self-healing system. Can you explain that a little bit, Tom?
If you look at this is the basic point of my book on vaccines and autoimmunity and the nature of childhood illness, that when you look at the typical childhood disease, like measles or chickenpox or mumps or any of them, even a cold or a flu, there's basically a two-step process that happens. The first is you get exposed to a virus, it infects the cells, and then your body's cell-mediated immunity goes in to digest those cells and essentially excrete them through the excretory channels of rash and mucus and cough and all those. So that process usually takes about 7 to 10 days, and it's what we call being sick. There's often a fever and a lot of congestion and mucus and all those other symptoms. The point is that first phase is what we call being sick. And then, because we don't want to have that same illness happen over and over again in our life, we have a second immune system called a humoral immune system, which remembers what happened. It essentially tags a piece of the virus or bacteria and makes antibodies against that part of that organism, so that if we ever get exposed to it again, we don't get our cell-mediated immune system involved, and we are basically immune for life. The point is, like you say, the self-healing part is the cell-mediated immune system, which clears out debris from our bodies, tissues, blood, and that part goes by itself. It takes 7 to 10 days, and that's a crucial part of our whole immunological well-being.
And so, how do vaccinations disrupt that system?
So the whole theory of the vaccines was, okay, the definition of being sick is the cell-mediated response. It's, by the way, not the virus technically that makes you sick. The virus stimulates a response, and it's the cell-mediated part that makes you sick. So the theory was, we don't want the being sick part. That's, first of all, unpleasant and can even be dangerous. We just want the memory part, otherwise known as the humoral or antibody part. So we're going to bypass the cell-mediated part and just give something, a piece of the virus and some, essentially toxin to stimulate an antibody response. And we were told that that would be the same as natural immunity. Mm-hmm. The thing about natural immunity, and if you think here, mumps, chickenpox, measles, all those, that is when you have both arms of the immune system working together, it's almost a foolproof 100% immune for life. And with the introduction of vaccines, I can still remember because I was old enough, we were told that one measles shot and you would also be immune for life, because measles immunity is the exact same as natural immunity. Mm-hmm. That theory was quickly debunked for a couple reasons. One is we knew that with an autoimmune disease called nephrotic syndrome, which is a kidney disease of children, that if they have nephrotic syndrome and they get measles while they have nephrotic syndrome, for some reason which was not understood, but now we know, the measles cures them of nephrotic syndrome. So they essentially get cured of this autoimmune disease because of the intense cell-mediated response that you get when you have measles. So of course they thought, well, if somebody has nephrotic syndrome, we can vaccinate them with measles and it will cure their nephrotic syndrome. And unfortunately, or depends how you look at it, I guess, it doesn't work at all. So there is no therapeutic response from a measles vaccine. The second reason we knew that is because there became outbreaks of college students, really for the first time, getting measles. And what that taught us is that the immunity that you get from a measles shot vaccine, it best lasts 10 to 12 years, sometimes less. And there is no possibility of lifelong immunity from measles as a result of the vaccine. And I just heard, actually, just today, a patient of mine said she's going away to Morocco or somewhere, and it's been more than 10 years since she's got her measles shot, and they told her that she needs to get another one because she's no longer immune for measles. What that's telling us is that they're not the same immunity, the natural immunity and the vaccine-induced immunity, because there is no involvement of the cell-mediated immune system with, generally speaking, with some there's a little bit, but with vaccines. And so therefore you will never get lifelong immunity. Therefore, and this is crucial, you will never get herd immunity through vaccinations.
You'll never get herd immunity. Tom, that's all I ever hear. That's what we're shooting for. They say, if you're not going to immunize yourself or your children for your own sake, well, then do it for the larger good, do it for the greater good. If you're not vaccinated, then you're putting everyone at risk. But you're saying that's not the case.
So if you look at the situation with even a disease like measles, which, by the way, and I'm actually looking at the CDC is required by law to report on the death rate of all the infectious communicable diseases at the end of the decade and the century. So when you look at the death rate from measles from 1900 to the year 2000, the death rate had dropped to almost zero by about 1952, 1953. That's 10 years before the measles vaccine was introduced.
10 years?
10 years. So the death rate had plummeted to almost zero. In fact, the biggest question here is, why didn't we celebrate the fact that public health measures and not, pooping in the streets and clean water and using doses of vitamin A to children who have measles, that completely eradicated measles as a public health threat 10 years before the vaccine. The vaccine had, according to the CDC and according to their statistics, had nothing to do with the decrease in death rate from measles. There was no change. Now, it's partly because we had herd immunity because of natural measles before the vaccine, because all the children got it, and all the children got it and they were immune for life. And all the mothers who had measles as children, they were able to give antibodies, so-called passive immunity, to their babies. So the most vulnerable time was when they were nursing and their babies were protected because of antibodies from the mother. Now we have a situation, knowing that the initial vaccine lasts maybe 10 to 12 years, subsequent vaccines last 2 to 3 years. The percentage of the adults who get measles shots every 2 to 3 years for the rest of their life is about 0%, maybe 1%.
Right.
Therefore, approximately 95% or so of the adults, which are more than 2/3 of the population, have no immunity to measles. And therefore, the number that they tell us that we have to have 90% of the population being immune to measles. So we have nowhere near that, because hardly any of the adults are immune, because their temporary vaccine-induced antibody have worn off. Mm-hmm. And so we've literally created a potential healthcare disaster with elderly and babies getting measles for the first time since the Native Americans.
Whoa, do you see that on the horizon, or is that happening now?
There was a prediction that in 2050 that the entire population will have virtually no immunity to measles. Now, I don't know whether that's going to happen because of the vaccines, but it's clear that the immunity is never lifelong. That's one of the biggest problems, and one of the reasons why this whole concept of herd immunity can only be achieved through letting the children at the appropriate age get measles and go through it successfully. It can never happen through a vaccine program.
Because if I understand you correctly, the immunity we get through vaccines doesn't last. Whereas if we get sick, it lasts for a lifetime.
I mean, that's not me saying it. First of all, if you try to figure out how many people got measles twice, it's almost zero. And then if I wasn't correct, then why do we vaccinate people against measles before they go to college? And why are we now recommending that adults renew their measles vaccine every 10 years? If I wasn't correct and the vaccine-induced immunity was the same as getting natural measles, why are we giving people boosters? That's not my policy. That's the CDC, Academy of Pediatrics, official medical doctrine.
Well, so talk to me about that. Since you mentioned the CDC and other doctors and scientists, what do they have to say about it? I know this information isn't exclusive to you.
It's a guy named Albert Sabin, who was the developer of the Sabin polio vaccine. And Sabin and Jonas Salk, were considered the pioneers, the modern inventors of the successful polio vaccine program. So interestingly, here's what he had to say about this, and I'm quoting now, quote, Albert Sabin, official data has shown that large-scale vaccination in the U.S. has failed to obtain any significant improvement of the diseases for which they were supposed to provide immunization. In essence, it was and is a failure. So that's one person in the normal world. He was one of the luminaries of the vaccine theory and product.
Mm-hmm. So, well, that's one person. But others say that vaccines are critical to the public health and that it's actually dangerous to question them. What would you say to someone that says that?
Well, I would say to show me the evidence. Here's another one. So there was a recent study. It's actually surprising and shocking how little actual scientific data studies have been done on showing not that vaccines don't reduce the incidence of the disease for which you're vaccinated against, but that they reduce all-cause mortality or the disease burden of the children. In other words, if you're going to vaccinate somebody with pertussis, there's two possible things you may want to know. One is, do the children get less pertussis who are vaccinated? And I would say the answer to that is yes. So that's how they report the data. Another question to ask is, do children who get vaccinated against pertussis have better health outcomes? Now, that's an entirely different question, which surprisingly has rarely been asked. Now, here's a quote from a guy named Soren Morgensen, did a study on a West African group. Half of the village got vaccinated with DPT and the other half didn't. Morgensen and a guy named Peter Abbey, who are the lead authors of this study, are some of the most prominent vaccine researchers in the world right now. And this was published in a peer-reviewed medical journal. And here's their conclusion. Quote, DPT was associated with a 5-fold higher mortality than being unvaccinated. No prospective study has shown beneficial survival effects of DPT. Unfortunately, DPT is the most widely used vaccine, and it is used globally as an indicator of the performance of national vaccine programs. So there's 2 points I want to emphasize of that study. The first is these people who are essentially made their living for decades on doing vaccine research, they say no prospective study has shown beneficial survival effects. So either, this is one of the main vaccines that we use, either you have to believe that these people just don't know the literature and don't know what they're talking about, because there's a lot of studies that show this, or that they're correct and they know the literature because it's their job, and they're saying there is no study that shows there's an improved benefit. The other thing about this study was, as they say, children who got DPT did have less pertussis, but they had a 5-fold higher mortality rate than the children who were unvaccinated. So in other words, something happened to these children so that they had a 5-fold higher rate of dying from other things, whether it's autoimmune disease, brain cancer, diarrhea, neglect, who knows? They just had a much higher rate of dying than unvaccinated in the closest we've ever gotten to looking at a matched control group to see what the health outcome is. So again, when you hear that there's an improvement, the improvement is in the rate of pertussis. But I would argue that's not what we want to know. We want to know, as parents and adults and doctors and other people interested in the health of our children, does the health improve when we vaccinate? And this study, and essentially every study I've ever seen, says no. There's a higher disease burden for very predictable reasons, which, I outlined in the book.
So I'm trying to pick my jaw up off the floor because this is really alarming. And I guess what I see you doing is you're kind of reframing how we look at vaccinations. They are indeed effective when it comes to perhaps reducing the amount of sickness or disease our children experience, but they're not effective when it comes to hitting our ultimate goal, which is conserving the health of our children.
Correct. And the reason for that is very well understood. It's not a mystery how and why this comes about. If you'd like, I could describe exactly how and why this comes about.
Sure, please do.
So basically, if you go back to my 2 immune system model, and that's of course not my model, that's, everybody learns that in medical school. So the point of a vaccine is to stimulate antibodies without a prior cell-mediated reaction. Now, if you ask most doctors and even pediatricians, so what's in a vaccine, like a chickenpox vaccine? They'll say, well, a piece of the chickenpox, the so-called antigenic part, and some normal saline, salt water, and a preservative. So the reality of the situation is if you put a piece of a virus or a tetanus toxoid and saline and a preservative and inject it into a person, you get no antibody response. It's the antibody response that protects a person against disease. So if you do that, you get no response. So the theorists and the early developers of the vaccine, they had a problem. So the problem was, how do you make that person make an antibody response? So the answer is you have to put an adjuvant, otherwise known as a helper, into the vaccine so that it stimulates the child to make antibodies. And then because it's mixed with the chickenpox or the measles or tetanus toxoid, one of the antibodies that you make will be against that virus or that toxin. Now, the important point to emphasize is 2. One is there is no way to give an adjuvant that only makes you make antibodies to that thing that's in the vaccine. It will make antibodies to whatever's in the vaccine, but the typical adjuvants are things like aluminum and formaldehyde and fetal DNA and surfactants and Roundup and all these other things that are in vaccines. They stimulate antibody responses in a non-specific way. In other words, you just start making antibodies. One of them is to the chickenpox virus. Another one, because there's peanut proteins in the vaccine, will be to peanut allergy, to peanuts. So you make antibodies to peanuts, so therefore you're going to have people who are allergic for the rest of their life to peanuts. So that's one of the problems is we have to use essentially poisons. You have to make the child make antibodies. It's not that they're mean or stupid and that's why they put aluminum in there. It's because it doesn't work otherwise, and there's no way around that. And I can't emphasize enough, this idea that some people say, well, let's make safe vaccines. Well, you can't, because you won't make a reaction.
Right.
Now, the problem with that is if you keep doing that over and over again, in other words, doing that being stimulate antibody production and release, and because I must admit I have a smart alecky tendency, I say, well, maybe it will work and you'll end up with a person with too many antibodies, since that's the whole point of the vaccine initiative in the first place.
Right.
So what do we mean by too many antibodies? What we mean is somebody with an autoimmune disease. In other words, the approximately 100 million people in the United States who have an autoimmune disease have a situation where they have accelerated antibody production.
Are you saying that these vaccinations are causing all these antibodies to appear in our bodies and later leading to chronic conditions?
It's not the only reason, but it's certainly a big part of it. Yes, I'm saying exactly that. But let me say that I'm not the only one. I keep saying that. So let me read a quote from a guy named Yehuda Schoenfeld, he's an Israeli, he's the editor of the Israeli Medical Association Journal, which is like the JAMA of Israel. He's the co-editor-in-chief of Autoimmunity Reviews. He's the editor of the Journal of Autoimmunology, and he's a member of the editorial board of the Clinical Reviews in Allergy and Immunology. And the only reason I say that is because it's likely he knows something about autoimmune disease.
Right.
So he says, quote, throughout our lifetime, the normal immune system walks a fine line between preserving normal immune reactions and developing autoimmune disease. The healthy immune system is tolerant to self-antigens. When self-tolerance is disturbed, dysregulation of the immune system follows, resulting in the emergence of autoimmune disease. Vaccination is one of the main conditions that disturbs this homeostasis, resulting in autoimmune phenomena and ASIA. ASIA stands for autoimmune syndrome induced by adjuvant, which apparently is going to be renamed the Schoenfeld syndrome. And he estimates there's at least 150 million people worldwide who have ASIA. In other words, they have autoimmune syndrome induced by adjuvants injected in vaccines, which he says can happen even 40 years later, because that's how long the aluminum, and they put detergents in there so the aluminum will be absorbed into the tissues better. That's how long it can stay in your system. So I didn't make this up. This is just a logical understanding and a review of the relevant literature on what happens when you vaccinate.
Coming up, Dr. Tom Cowan sheds light on the studies that many point to when they say the science is settled and that there is absolutely no link between vaccines and autism. How do these studies hold up under scrutiny? We pause now for a quick thank you to our sponsors, Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements offer New Zealand-sourced bone marrow and nose-to-tail organ meats like liver, heart, kidney, pancreas, spleen, and more in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Traditional peoples and early ancestral healers believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would strengthen and support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. So, a person with a weak heart, for example, was fed the heart of a healthy animal, and so on. I know organ meats are great for us, but I don't think I get enough of them in my own diet. So I personally went ahead and got some of these supplements myself. So visit ancestralsupplements.com today to get some too. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. You know we are member supported, right? So thanks for helping us do what we do. And we are doing amazing things thanks to your donations, including advocating for the legalization of raw milk and much more. But we don't have time to explain it all right here on the show. So this Wednesday, August 29th, we have planned a Facebook Live with Sally Fallon Morell, the head of the foundation, to let you know just what we're up to. It's super exciting, you guys. So just go to Facebook around 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, August 29th to watch. And we'll see you then. I love that you are going into the science here and bringing these quotes to our attention, and even the ingredients of the vaccines. I understand in the back of your book you have some appendices with the actual ingredients of vaccinations. And this is really important because one of the goals of the foundation is to educate. And you're doing that, Tom. You're not making this up.
I am not making this up. We did put a list, which I got largely from the CDC's own website. The CDC is basically the sales arm, essentially, of the vaccines. And they are required to put the ingredient list, and so that's where I got most of it from.
So I just have a couple more questions for you as we start to wrap up. I have to ask about the elephant in the room. You know, a lot of government officials and scientists say that the science is settled, that there is no link between autism and vaccinations. What studies are they referring to, and how reliable are they?
So I have an appendix in the book that says, but don't the studies prove there is no link between vaccines and autism? Let me just talk about one of the ones which is considered the so-called nail in the coffin for the vaccine autism connection. This was a study done in 2010 by a guy named Smith and others. And essentially what they tell us is this was a study that showed that the vaccinated don't have more autism or neurodevelopmental illness than the unvaccinated. And that, therefore, this was, as they said, the nail in the coffin. Mm-hmm. Now, most doctors, most people and scientists, and most people who say this about this lack of connection, they don't actually read the study. But because I had to do that, and it's pretty tedious, but I did, what you find is that the Smith et al. Study looked at two groups, and they called them actually not the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated, but the timely vaccines versus untimely. So the timely vaccine in the first year got an average of 11.8 vaccines. The untimely, which is the group that some people call the unvaccinated, in the first year got 10.1 vaccines. So they were far from unvaccinated.
Yeah.
And what they did was they delayed a little bit, and we don't know if there's any significant difference between somebody who gets 10.1 vaccines in the first year versus somebody who gets 11.8. So that's the first flaw, is it's certainly not vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and it's hardly any difference at all, even in the number of vaccines they got. But the other thing, and for anybody who's really interested in the science and wants to really get into the wonky part of this, mm-hmm. There's a website called vaccinepapers.org, and he goes into gory detail in the 48 papers that the American Academy of Pediatrics touts to show there is no connection between vaccines and autism. And what he points out is that the CDC actually puts out guidelines that authors have to use to adjust their numbers to account for the fact of, for instance, why did these people in the untimely group actually delay their vaccines? Was it because they were seeing problems? Was it because they had a sibling with autism? Was it because they were too poor? Was it because they were uneducated? Or who knows? You know, what was the reason?
Yeah.
It turns out that if you follow the CDC guidelines for how to adjust this, because if everybody in the, quote, untimely group had a sibling with autism, then you would expect that they would have more autism because they're not the same. It's not really a matched control. So if you follow the guidelines, you actually find, unlike what the conclusion says, that they did have more autism in the normal vaccinated, the timely group, than the untimely group.
Oh.
So the bottom line is the conclusion, even in this small difference, was not significant. The number of vaccines wasn't significantly different, even then, they still were able to show that the children who got more vaccines, in fact, had more developmental issues, neurodevelopmental issues, including autism, exactly what they say this paper is designed to show was not the case.
So
there's others. That was the nail in the coffin, the crown jewel of the argument that there's no connection.
So, Tom, there have to be people in the medical community or doctors who can see it as plain as day, just as you're describing it here. So, why aren't there more alarm bells going off? Or someone saying something's amiss here?
I mean, that's a good question. There are a lot of people, Robert Kennedy Jr. is certainly saying that. The vaccine papers, there's a number of different books. A guy named Hanley wrote a book on ending the autism epidemic, where he goes through studies after study about this. The literature is full of the references. There's Neil Miller wrote a 400 study, all peer reviewed, on all these links that I'm talking about between not having childhood diseases and increase of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, glioblastoma later in life, that going through measles, going through chickenpox, that does protect you against further disease later in life. That was really the point of my book.
Right.
Why other people don't believe it, I don't know, but I ran across an interesting story that might say something about that, and I don't want to get too far into this, but this was a study that's completely sort of off the subject. But there was a big debate with strokes, whether to give clot-busting medicines, whether those would prevent complications and allow better outcomes with strokes.
Mm-hmm.
So they did a number of these trials, and they found no benefit from using clot-busting drugs. And then Genentech got a new drug, and they did a study which had a kind of a poor design, but they got a positive result. And that led them to get the FDA to license their clot-busting drug for every future patient with stroke who comes in the hospital. Now, there was a lot of ER doctors in particular who said, this was a poor study, we need to redo the study because we're seeing a lot of bad things. And a guy named Grossbard, who is a senior scientist at Genentech, has the following quote when questioned about why don't they do another study. Quote, "We don't know how another study would turn out. And if we don't come out ahead, we would have a tremendously self-inflicted wound. Another study may be a good thing for America, but it wasn't going to be a good thing for us."
Oh.
So there you go. He knew that this was probably going to be a bad study. They have no reason to do it. They don't want to do it. They wouldn't even facilitate another study being done because, as he said, it would be a self-inflicted wound. And so they don't do it. And he was honest enough to say, might be a good thing for the patients, but wouldn't be a good thing for us. Whether that's behind the lack of public information, I can't say.
Right.
There's certainly a lot of big money involved in this and a lot of liability from the government because, as I'm sure you know, the vaccine manufacturers have total indemnity against any liability from injury from a vaccine, or even if the vaccine doesn't work. That was a 1986 law.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't sue a vaccine manufacturer. The U.S. government has a compensation court which essentially gives money to people who are injured. They've already given out about $4 billion, and that's, some people say, 0.1% of the damages. So the government is potentially on the hook for $4 trillion, which I don't blame them for not wanting to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Except, of course, if their goal is to help the people of the United States, which then they would want to find some way to deal with this problem.
Well, so to kind of summarize, what I think I hear you saying is that with the choices available to us as parents or as conscious woke adults, for lack of a better term, is that we're making a trade-off. When we vaccinate, we do spare ourselves or our children the short-term sickness, but we end up with long-term chronic conditions or higher mortality rates, as in the case of the DTP you were saying.
That's certainly what the studies look like. And what, also it looks like just looking around the population. I mean, there was very little autoimmune disease 50 years ago. And even the people say, oh, we've always had the same amount of autism as we always have. We just know how to diagnose it better. I would only say, so where are all the autistic 70-year-olds? Like, I don't know about you, but I don't know any. And where are all the 70-year-olds with peanut allergies? And I don't know about you, but I don't know any.
Nope.
There was almost nobody with autoimmune disease in children when I was in grade school. So we are in the midst of a huge change in the character of illness in this country. And I mean, they say we don't know why, and they say we're not. We just didn't know how to diagnose hay fever back in 1920. So guy comes to you and says, every time I go outside in April, I sneeze. We didn't know what to make of that. And I don't personally believe that. I think something is affecting our health, and it's a pretty plausible biological argument that I'm not saying it's the only thing, because certainly glyphosate and the food and the water and the stress and all these things have to do with it. But boy, vaccines are certainly part of this mix.
So Tom, if the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do? And we can put that in the context of our conversation today.
I would say if we're talking about children and parents, and especially around vaccines, unfortunately, one can't trust the usual authorities these days. So I would go and strongly question any vaccine provider and say, can you please show me the literature that says children who are vaccinated have better health outcomes? And show me the studies that show that this is a good thing for the health and future well-being of my child. And if they can provide them, which I don't know about any such study, more power to it. But to take a unquestioning eye these days is just, outdated and naive.
Thank you for speaking your mind, Tom, and for telling it like it is. I hope our listeners take this to heart, and we'll check out your book. We'll put a link to the resources we mentioned in our conversation today in the show notes. And thank you again for taking your time, and I look forward to seeing you at the conference in November. Okay,
thank you again.
My guest today was Dr. Tom Cowan. For more on Tom, go to his website, fourfoldhealing.com. For today's show notes and resources like the links we mentioned and a link to Tom's new book, go to our website, westinaprice.org. Go to the podcast page and look for the show notes for episode 149. Oh, and on that same podcast page, you'll see our listener survey. Please fill it out for us. It'll just take a second or two to fill out, I promise, and it would mean the world to us. We're just trying to get to know you a little bit better so we can make sure our shows are hitting the mark. And thank you. Also, when you get a chance, we would love it if you would rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. We are so close to 300 reviews. We can almost taste it. So help us get there, and thank you in advance. Next week, we speak with Jessica Prentice. Jessica is one of the founders of Three Stone Hearth, a community-supported kitchen in Berkeley, California, that uses local, sustainable ingredients to prepare nutrient-dense traditional foods on a community scale. She is passionate about ancestral food traditions, the healing nature of food, our impact on the ecosystem, and more. She is deep, I'm telling you, and she has lived out what we talk about. You're going to love this conversation. Finally, a quick thank you to our faithful team of podcast interns. Post-production assistants include Cynthia Castro Cohen Enriquez, Deirdre Beard, Diva Rizvi, Melanie Ahern, and Aria O'Hara. Cheryl Hufdelin helps with social media. Mary Hine, Olga de Villiers, and Joy de los Santos boost sponsorship and help with special projects. Our listening team includes Heather Carpentier and Victor Coseto. And Amy Matias helps with transcriptions. Hey, and let's just keep in touch, everybody. I'm on Instagram at holistic_Hilda. Follow me for health tips, podcast stuff, and behind the scenes on the show, and me. Thanks, everybody, and see you soon.
Have you been enjoying these podcasts? Have you benefited from them or from the resources on the website or local chapter meetings? If so, please become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's only $25 for students and seniors and $40 for a general membership. Your contribution is critical for the continued work of the foundation. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.